Good day. Today is Friday, 6th December, and as at the time of making this program, there is still no sign of any stabilization of the situation in Syria after the fall of Hama. There are reports that the jihadi fighters have been pushing south towards the next big city of Homs. There were reports yesterday that the Syrian army would try to hold out north of Homs, but some reports are suggesting, and I want to stress some reports because there are other contradictory reports. Some reports are suggesting that the Syrian defences around Homs are every bit as brutal as those which existed previously around Hama, and that the Syrian military, some parts of the Syrian military, are already starting to retreat or pull back from Homs as well. Now, of course, this may be misinformation. I'm not sure. We will no doubt find out in due course. There are, however, also further reports that large numbers of civilians are leaving Homs. Again, this does not seem to be an organised evacuation carried out by the Syrian authorities, but it seems to be a evacuation of fleeing from the city, carried out spontaneously by the people of Homs themselves. So, no evidence so far of any genuine stabilization of the situation. Now, the Russian journalist Marat Hayrulin, who is an extremely well-connected journalist, he is close to the Russian military, and he's one of the outstanding war reporters of the fighting in Ukraine from the Russian side, indeed from any side. Anyway, he is saying that the reason for the sudden collapse of government resistance in Aleppo was that the division, the Syrian army division, that was supposed to be defending Aleppo, apparently defected en masse to the rebels, that the officers and soldiers of this division simply melted away. And that, if it's true, and by the way, I should make it clear, I have not read Khairulin's original report. I've seen reports about it, but I've not seen the report itself, which I suspect is circulating in Russian media. But if it's true, then that would tend to reinforce my own rather sour view of the situation, which is that, consistent with what I've heard about the explosion of corruption in Syria that has taken place since the end of the fighting in 2019, that large numbers of people have been basically bribed to defect, and that this explains the speed of the Syrian army's collapse. Now, there continues to be a huge amount of recriminations about this, people pointing their fingers at various parties. The Russians supposedly for sitting back and enabling the jihadi fighters to withdraw to Idlib province and to establish a safe zones there. The Iranians for taking their eye off the ball and not providing President Assad with the necessary help at the crucial time when he needed it. The Russians, again, for not providing the air defense of Syria and of Syrian positions that people said. And, of course, there's been a huge amount said about the effect of the sanctions, the fact that the sanctions have caused a massive contraction of the Syrian economy, a contraction of around 85% of the Syrian economy, and of the fact that the United States still controls a large belt of territory in eastern Syria, denying the Syrian government the source of oil revenues, which the Syrian government had previously used in order to fund its work and to keep the economy and basic infrastructure running. Now, all of these points are valid in themselves, but in my opinion, they still don't answer the ultimate question of why a Syrian army, which had resisted courageously in much more difficult economic and political circumstances between 2011 and 2019, is not able this time, apparently, to organise effective resistance. Various maps have been produced by various people showing the situation in the country in 2014, 2015, showing the small belts of territory that the Syrian army at that time controlled, which is only a fraction of the territory that the Syrian army, that the Syrian government nominally controls today. And people have been, so some of these commentators have been saying that this shows that the situation is nowhere near as desperate as it was then, and it's not therefore irretrievable. However, this ignores the fact that at that time, when, of course, Syria was also subject to sanctions, when jihadi fighters occupied most of the country, when the oil in eastern Syria was out of reach by the Syrian government, well, at that time, the Syrian army was fighting, and was fighting courageously. It was holding out in Hama and in Aleppo. It was resisting, and resisting successfully. This time, despite the situation being less difficult, at least to all appearances, it is not resisting. And I have to say, one can point fingers at the Russians, one can point fingers at the Iranians, but the underlying problems have to be found within Syria itself. Let me just quickly add, by the way, to the list of other things, that, of course, there has been a significant amount of Israeli bombing, but nowhere near as intense, for example, as the bombing that has been conducted in other places many times, and we've seen armies able to continue fighting despite bombing which has been far more intense and far more heavy than anything that Israel has conducted in Syria itself. Let me just quickly add here that when the Russians first intervened in Syria in 2015, they actually came to an agreement with the Israelis. I remember very well how it happened at the time. Netanyahu visited Moscow. There were discussions between him and Putin. And the Russians at that time agreed with the Israelis that the Russians, their air force, would focus on fighting the jihadi fighters who were seeking to overthrow President Assad's government. They would not involve themselves in the general conflict between Syria and Israel, and basically Syria would have to deal with that by itself. The points that the Russians made at the time, and which, as far as I'm aware, the Israelis have mostly honoured, is that the Russians said that the Israelis should not attack Russian troops or Russian facilities in Syria. That was a red line. That the Israelis should not interfere with the Syrian army's operations against jihadi fighters, and that they should not take action in Damascus itself, which would threaten the existence of the Syrian government. And overall, the Israelis have generally complied with that, and they've conducted raids against Hezbollah and Iranian facilities in Syria, and sometimes they've attacked Syrian facilities also. But the Russians have never at any time said that they would act to defend Syria from Israeli attack. That was not the basis upon which they intervened in 2015. The Russians, incidentally, at that time also categorically ruled out sending ground troops to Syria. They always said that it would have to be the Syrian government and the Syrian army that would have to carry out most of the fighting, the ground fighting in Syria, supplemented by militia forces and special forces from Iran and Hezbollah and the various other regional allies that Syria has. So I don't think that this collapse can be explained by the bombing. The sanctions have all played undoubtedly a very significant role. The Russians have not intervened to help Syria come through this crisis up to this point. But then they never said that they would, at least not in the sense that people imagine. They never said they would defend Syria from attack by Israel. They never said that they would involve themselves in the Syrian-Israeli wars. They also always ruled out sending ground troops. The entire Russian intervention in Syria in 2015 was that Russia would provide air support, but that the fighting on the ground would be carried out by the Syrian army and its regional allies. And so all of these explanations, though individually they are, valid, they don't nonetheless, or so it seems to me, explain the overall problem, the crisis that has arisen now. And I have to say again that in order to understand the crisis, one has to go back and look at the decisions and policies that the Syrian government itself has followed in the 5 years since the end of the war. It seems to me that President Assad has been busy sorting out relations with all of his various adversaries in the region, the Arab states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. He's managed to get Syria back into the Arab League. He's done this with every country, every key country in the region, apart obviously from Israel, which is excluded, and the country that really mattered, which was Turkey. And here, I have to say, I think he made a very serious and perhaps ultimately fatal mistake. Because those who say that the Syrian army and the Russian Air Force should have acted to clear Idlib have to confront the reality that there are Turkish troops in Idlib, that northern Idlib is to a great extent under Turkish protection, and those who say that the Syrians should have been backed by the Russians to clear eastern Syria, bringing the Kurds back under control, pushing out the Americans, and that this should have been done by force of arms, need also to take into account the fact that the United States has a military presence in eastern Syria. Again, this says, these statements imply that the Russians should have been prepared to face down or confront militarily the Turkey in northern Idlib and the Americans in eastern Syria on Syria's behalf, on President Assad's behalf. Now, the Russians never said that they would do that. They always said that this was outside the remit of their intervention in 2015. And given that the Russians are in a vulnerable position in the Middle East, where US forces have many more bases and are far more powerful than Russian forces, expecting the Russians to fight the Americans in eastern Syria is a very tall order, and expecting the Russians to fight the Turks in Idlib or to confront the Turks in Idlib in a way which would put the entire relationship between Russia and Turkey in question is a very tall order indeed, given the importance of Turkey, the relationship with Turkey to Russia, which I have discussed in previous programs. The point is that even in the difficult situation in which he found himself, there were things that President Assad could have done. Now, Erdogan wanted to mend fences with him. He wanted to meet him. There would no doubt have been very difficult and very complicated discussions between Assad and Erdogan. But the point is that Erdogan was there, and what Assad, in my opinion, should have done is established a proper dialogue with Erdogan, precisely in order to engineer a situation in which Erdogan agreed to remove his troops from Idlib and effectively allow that territory to be brought back under Syrian control. And again, if we're talking about eastern Syria and the American presence there, the person who could have provided the key to sorting out that problem, it seems to me, was also Erdogan, in the sense that Erdogan is also very unhappy about the American presence in eastern Syria, about the fact that through American support, the Syrian Kurds have been able to carve out a kind of protectorate in eastern Syria. And again, the way to have squeezed the Americans out would have been for Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, none of which want the American presence in eastern Syria to continue, to have come together and essentially squeezed the Americans out. As, in my opinion, if there had been a rapprochement between Syria and Turkey, would probably have happened. That would have brought the oil wells in eastern Syria back under Syrian government control, probably ultimately resolving that problem. Assad never did any of these things. He consistently refused many offers from Erdogan for a meeting. He refused advice from the Russians to meet with Erdogan. He made demands that Erdogan withdraw Turkish troops from Syria as a condition for a meeting. And the result is that the situation on Syria's northern borders was never in the end resolved. Had there been a rapprochement between Syria and Turkey, unsatisfactory though that might have been, then of course many of these problems, the problems with the sanctions, the problems with eastern Syria, the problems in Idlib province, might eventually have been brought under control. At least a process would have been created which might have led to that outcome. But Assad didn't do that. Apparently, or perhaps, he expected that Erdogan would eventually exit the scene. There have been reports at various times that Erdogan is not in particularly good health. Erdogan has faced significant opposition within Turkey itself. Some of the elections that have taken place in Turkey have thrown up significant challenges to Erdogan. But the fact is, Erdogan is still there, and Assad therefore faces the problems that he currently faces on his northern borders. Now, of course, there will be people who will say that Erdogan is an impossibly difficult negotiator, which he is, that he is faithless and cannot be trusted, which is true. All of this is absolutely correct. But it still seems to me that setting up a negotiating process, getting arrangements going in which Syria would have been backed by Iran and Russia and increasingly by the Arab states, would have worked out a lot better for Assad in the end than the situation which we see. Now, why it didn't happen, I suspect that's partly the result of miscalculations on Assad's part, but also I suspect a product of internal Damascus politics, the fact that there was strong opposition from many political forces in Damascus to any kind of rapprochement with Turkey, with Erdogan specifically, which I'm not going to pretend I fully understand. But anyway, the result is this accumulation of problems has been allowed to fester and grow. And in the meantime, it's clear that the Syrian military, which had been a viable and effective force, was apparently neglected. A mistake was made, presumably assuming that the war was basically over. I've heard it suggested, and of course this I absolutely cannot confirm, that after the war was ended, many of the original generals and colonels and people of that kind who had proved their mettle in the war were gradually eased out and replaced by functionaries who were had political pull in Damascus itself, who Assad wanted to appease. Well, that all may be true, but I don't want to speculate about things I don't know much more about. Anyway, there it is. We have this situation. Now, we will see what happens over the next couple of days and weeks. It could be that despite the reports I'm hearing today, the Syrian army will be able to hold on to Homs. If Homs falls, there have been all kinds of reports that this will lead to a total collapse in Syria, and that it will cut off the regions on the coastline, which appear to be still loyal to Assad, and the Russian bases in Tartus and Khmeimim, from access to the government in Damascus, lending those bases supposedly unviable. And there are also claims that it will open the road to Damascus. Now, all of that is possible, but I have to say, and again, I'm not a person particularly skilled at looking at maps, it doesn't seem to me to be obviously the case from the maps I am seeing. Obviously, loss of Homs would be a body blow to the Syrian government and the Syrian military. It would enlarge and deepen the crisis significantly. But I don't think that in and of itself it would be a terminal blow. What is the terminal blow is if the Syrian army continues on its present course of offering no effective resistance. As for the Russian bases, the naval base in Tartus, which people talk about, is a much overstated thing. There is not much of a naval base in Tartus and never has been. A refueling station might be a more accurate description of what it is. But the Russians have invested significantly in building up the air base in Khmeimim, and obviously that will be a major blow to them if they lose it, particularly as they appear to have seen the air base in Khmeimim as a means of extending their influence over the Eastern Mediterranean, something I have discussed in previous programs. I think that the Russians would probably calculate that for the moment those two bases are safe and viable. There's been no sign so far that the jihadi fighters are proposing to attack these bases. And as I said, I don't think the fall of Homs in itself makes control of these bases impossible for the Russians. Having said that, as I said, if the collapse continues, if Homs falls and the jihadi fighters press on towards Damascus, and if they continue to meet no resistance, then of course the whole calculus changes. And though Khmeimim is a very useful asset, the abandonment of which by Russia would certainly be both a significant prestige blow and a cause of a loss of power projection capability in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is not, as far as Russia is concerned, obviously an existential asset. It is not an existential matter. The Russians can afford to withdraw from Khmeimim, much as they would prefer not to have to do so. Now, to repeat again a point I have made previously, if the Syrian army does get its act together, if President Assad is able to find military units that are prepared to fight, if the jihadis somewhere are stopped, whether at Homs or closer to Damascus or somewhere, then the calculus may start to change. The Russians are still there in Khmeimim. As I've discussed many times, they have an abundance of air assets. They are far more powerful than they were in 2015. There are reinforcements arriving, the Russians, from Lebanon, from Iraq, and apparently from Iran itself. And those who say that the jihadis are now overextended are probably telling the truth. And I've seen many claims, many reports which point out that the terrain in northern Syria with little cover, exposes the jihadi fighters to severe risk from aerial attacks, such as the Russian Air Force is certainly able to mount. So, if there is a stabilization at some point, then, as I said, the whole situation could reverse, and perhaps even reverse quite quickly. But in order for that to happen, that stabilization must first take place. And that must mean the Syrian army actually stabilizing itself, sorting out its problems, establishing coherent defense lines, and fighting again with something like the same spirit that it showed during the war of 2011 to 2019. Now, there's going to be, as I said, much discussion and commentary about all of this, and discussion about how all of this came to happen. But for the moment, at least, the situation remains fluid, but from a Syrian point of view, extremely grave. Now, looking further, there are reports in the Israeli media that the Israeli government is now starting to look at the possibility of a total Syrian collapse. There's even reports that the Israelis are now thinking of establishing a buffer zone inside Syria itself. All I would say about that is that it would be a further case of Israel taking on even more overextension. I'm not going to analyze that even further. But nonetheless, if Syria does collapse, then of course this will change significantly the military and geopolitical calculus in the Middle East. Hezbollah and Iran will undoubtedly be significant losers. In fact, the position of Hezbollah will certainly be made much more vulnerable. Though in the Middle East, things have a strange way of turning out, and one perhaps ought not to make too many predictions and assessments too far ahead of events. I noticed that President Pezeshkian in Iran, who seems to be very shocked by these events, has recently spoken about Iran's need to forge closer alliances with Russia and China. And for the record, there are also reports that the first Sukhoi 35 fighter jets have arrived in Iran as part of that big arms deal that Iran agreed with Russia some time ago. So we could see a tightening of remaining alliances. The rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran has held. So it's not impossible that even if there is a Syrian collapse, the geometry of the Middle East could rearrange itself in ways that no one fully expects or anticipates. But in the meantime, as I said, it all depends on the Syrian army. Tomorrow, on the 7th of December, the Tripartite meeting of foreign ministers from Russia, Iran and Turkey is supposed to be taking place in Doha. Apparently Lavrov is on his way, and I suspect the other two foreign ministers will be on their way as well. It is clear that the party at the moment in the strongest position is Turkey. That may not be something that many people want to like very much, but for the moment, they hold the strongest cards. At the current time, the Turkish government, Erdogan's government, are talking more about starting a reconciliation process between the Syrian government and the opposition. So they have not reverted to the position that they took in 2011 of denying President Assad's legitimacy and publicly saying that they sought his overthrow. That might come, and it could very well still be their private agenda. But the fact that they are holding back from taking that position in public suggests that they're still looking for some kind of deal, something which would be very, very much in Erdogan's which would accord very much with Erdogan's personality. So it could be that some kind of deal will be arranged or agreed in Doha, perhaps a ceasefire along the current lines or a freeze, though nobody would trust Erdogan and the jihadi fighters in holding to that for any very great length of time. The Russians and the Iranians might even try to persuade the Turks to put pressure on the jihadi fighters to actually pull back in some places. Who knows? But ultimately, the only guarantee of Syria's future as a secular state, and by the way, I ought to make it very clear that I place no weight whatsoever on the various claims that some of the jihadi leaders are making in Syria, that they've undergone some sudden conversion and are prepared to embrace diversity of religious views and any of that in Syria itself. I think, to say it frankly, if the jihadis gain control of Syria, it will be a dark time for many of the religious communities in Syria that do not follow Sunni Islam, and we're likely to see a long pattern of conflict and violence in Syria, which will probably continue for many, many years and even decades. But anyway, putting all that aside, it is the Syrian army, ultimately, that is the only force that can preserve the Syrian state. This has always been true. It was true between 2011 and 2019. It was the success of the Syrian army at that time in holding off the jihadis that eventually made it possible for the Russians to intervene in order to reverse the situation in Syria. And it is the Syrian army today which has to act in order to preserve Syria in this crisis that it is facing. If that doesn't happen, then, as I said, it does seem to me that there is a real risk that the Syrian state could collapse with all the dark consequences that I have spoken about and the uncertainties about the future of the Middle East that could quite easily follow. Anyway, this is my assessment of the situation today. I have to say that for the moment, to anyone who wants to see a peaceful, stable, prosperous Syria, the news is far from good, but this is not yet played out, and we will see what happens over the next few days and weeks, whether Homs can be held. I have to say, based on what I'm hearing, that seems unlikely, and whether the Syrian army can somehow reconstitute itself in this crisis, and what President Assad, from whom, by the way, we are hearing very, very little. He has not yet addressed the Syrian people, which I find surprising and concerning. He's been almost invisible. He made some statements in a conversation he had with the president of Abkhazia, I believe, which is an odd person to contact at a time like this. He's been seen with the foreign minister of Iran. But in a situation like this, I would have thought that an address from Assad to the Syrian people explaining the position and what he proposes to do is absolutely essential. And I hope that we will see it at some point over the next few days. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation as I see it in Syria today. Let's now talk about that other big crisis, which is playing out, which is the one in Ukraine, where the direction of events is completely different. And here perhaps I ought to make one thing completely clear, that important though the crisis in Syria is, it is the Ukraine war that matters far more. Ultimately, it is the Ukraine crisis that is acting as the great catalyst in rearranging the whole pattern of world events, as we have clearly seen over the last 3 years. But anyway, the big story in the Ukraine crisis over the last 24 hours is the interview that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has given to Tucker Carlson. Lavrov speaks fluent English, and it's possible, therefore, to watch his interview in English. He was able to answer clearly and comprehensively all of Tucker Carlson's questions. The interview lasted for about 1 hour and 20 minutes. And as I say, it was very comprehensive, and it discussed many things, including the overall relationship between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the United States. But specifically on the question of Ukraine, which is the heart of the whole issue between the United States and Russia, and between the West and Russia, and which is the main driver in international relations. Well, on that question, Lavrov again was extremely clear. He set out what is now the standard Russian position as articulated by President Putin when he visited the foreign ministry in June, and it basically amounted to this. The four regions, the four oblasts, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, are Russian. There is no scope or reason from a Russian point of view to negotiate about that anymore. Ukraine, and by extension the Western powers, must recognize the territorial realities. NATO membership of Ukraine remains the single most important issue from Russia's point of view in terms of the overall conflict. The Russians will never agree to NATO membership of Ukraine. Indeed, of any part of Ukraine. That was the clear implication of what Lavrov was saying. There must be no Western bases in Ukraine, no Western military presence in Ukraine. That seemed to me to rule out any idea that the Russians could be sweet-talked into agreeing to the presence of Western peacekeepers in any form in Ukraine as part of any peace deal. So Lavrov categorically ruled all of that out. And he also made it clear that neutrality, Ukraine would have to embrace neutrality. That would mean changes to its constitution. And it would have to to reverse all of the steps that Ukraine has been taking for several years now, basically starting from 2014, from the moment when the Maidan movement seized power in Ukraine. But Lavrov spoke specifically about 2017, when Ukraine began to pass legislation. It would have to reverse all of the steps that were taken to outlaw the use and teaching of the Russian language. In fact, Russian would have to be restored, in effect, as a language in Ukraine, a language which people were allowed to use and teach to their children. It might actually go significantly further than that in any peace deal. That is my own sense. The Orthodox Church would have to be essentially restored. Ukraine is trying to basically outlaw the canonical Orthodox Church, canonical obviously from a Russian point of view. There would have to be a complete reversal, in other words, of all the trend in legislation that Ukraine has been taking ever since the Maidan seizure of power in 2014. The entire Maidan project of Ukrainization of Ukraine, the enforcement of a uniculture based on the Ukrainian language, a complete rewriting of history to reflect the Ukrainian national narrative, the attempt to extinguish all elements of the Russian presence in Ukraine. All of that would have to be completely reversed and set aside in a way that would make it impossible to start it all over again. And there would have to be a whole host of other things done concerning the size of the Ukrainian military, the presence of the nationalist groups in Ukraine, the nationalist militias, all of those things. So what Lavrov is demanding is something that goes well beyond what, as I said, the Ukrainian national movement would ever accept. And it is going to be very difficult indeed, I think, politically, for President Zelensky and his government to accept it either. I have to repeat again at this point an observation I have made in several programs now, but which remains true and which must always be borne in mind, that the Russians are winning the war. They're winning the war comprehensively. There is no prospect of that victory being reversed. The trend of military events is now absolutely clear and is irreversible. In fact, when I discuss the military situation in Ukraine shortly, we will see that that military course of events which I've described not only continues, but continues very much in the Russians' favour. And given that this is so, and given that the Russians have withstood the sanctions pressure that has been applied against them, given that their economy is growing, that real living standards in Russia are rising, that investment continues to remain high, that Russia is currently running a budget surplus. It might not do so for the year as a whole, but for the moment it is. Given that Russia is also running a strong trade surplus, despite all the attempts to limit or restrict Russian exports, given all of that, the Russians have no reason or incentive to compromise for the moment on any of these things. Now, it might be that they could be persuaded to look beyond the Ukraine conflict and to come to terms in a way that allows a Ukrainian statehood to survive. But they have laid out the terms, and I don't think they're going to retreat significantly from them. A neutral Ukraine, with, as I said, the Maidan revolution in effect extinguished and reversed, and the 4 oblasts under Russian control. I think that any discussion, any negotiation must start with an understanding that that continues to be the Russian position. The Russians do want, and this is my own clear view, and again, all the things that Lavrov was saying over the course of the interview, he spoke at length, for example, about the good relationship that the Russians would like to have with the United States and with all other countries. I've no doubt that is true, by the way. Lavrov also basically made clear what Putin has said on many occasions, that the Russians want stability on their western borders. I mean, he didn't say it in exactly those words, but that was what he implied. Well, the Russians would be prepared to come to some kind of a settlement that would preserve Western interests, preserve core Western interests, satisfy Western concerns about the West's security, which, by the way, Lavrov went at pains to point out, is not actually threatened. And the Russians would be prepared to come to agreements to, as I said, preserve Ukraine itself. But they're not going to concede on anything fundamental or existential to themselves. And they've said so, and they've said so repeatedly, and that isn't going to change. So I think that, this is something that people like General Kellogg and various people in the United States, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, all of those people need to take into account. I say this, as I said, sanctions, threats of sanctions, are not going to deter the Russians. The Russians have brushed off all of the sanctions up to this point, and there's never been a single moment in the Ukrainian crisis where they have made any kind of concessions because of the effect of sanctions or the threat of them. And I don't for a moment believe that they're going to start doing so now. And in terms of the military situation, they have every reason to be confident, and all the talk about flooding Ukraine with more weapons from the West, I don't think the Russians take that particularly seriously. Putin has said that the Russians have great understanding of the size of Western stockpiles, of the types of weapons that have been allocated by the West to be supplied to Ukraine, where those weapons are, how many of them are going to be sent, all of those things. Maybe he was overstating things, maybe he was even making it up. But I get the sense overall that the Russians are very confident that the gap in military capabilities between themselves and the Ukrainians is only going to increase over the next couple of years, assuming the war goes on for more years. And even if the West does eventually get its act together and starts cranking out weapons in much greater quantity, it will be long after the war in Ukraine is over and the Russians have won. Now, I say all of this, I ought to say that Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done another excellent program pointing out, based on one of his articles, by the way, pointing out how, because of military industrial limitations, Western options in Ukraine are narrowing. And I also get the sense that on the specific issue of the missile strikes on Russia, the ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes on Russia, the Russians feel that they have called the West's bluff, that ultimately the bluff was not by them, it was on them, and they have called it. Now, interestingly, over the last few hours, the Russians have confirmed that there was indeed a telephone call between Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian military, and General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. We had a report about it in the New York Times, but the Russian Defense Ministry has now provided its own account. That came out late yesterday, and I'll read it. It says, on 27th November, the Russians published this on the 5th of December, notice, so almost 2 weeks after the call took place. On 27th November, on the initiative of the Russian side, Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, General of the Army Valery Gerasimov, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces of the United States of America, General Charles Brown, had a telephone call. During the conversation, the American side was informed of exercises in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea by groups of forces of the Russian Navy and Russian Aerospace Forces with live fires and launch of precision missiles. The information was provided in order to prevent possible incidents due to the presence of United States and NATO ships in the vicinity of the Russian exercise area. And that's the entire report. So, if you believe the Russian Ministry of Defense, the most senior military officer of the Russian military, the man who is in overall charge of the campaign in Ukraine, took time off to call the most senior military officer of the United States military, General Brown, in order to inform him that the Russians were going to conduct an exercise, a naval exercise, in the eastern Mediterranean. Well, you can believe that if you wish. If you do believe it, then I have another of my many bridges to sell you. Just saying. The reality is, and I have no doubt of this at all, that Gerasimov telephoned Brown in order to make Brown understand, to impress on Brown, the fact that when the Russians talk about red lines in terms of missile strikes on their territory, they are being completely serious about this. The Oreshnik strike on the factory in Dnipro is a demonstration of a real capability. and that the United States should be under no illusions about that, and that if the US military and the United States continues to cross Russian red lines in that kind of way, there must be no doubt that the Russians will indeed act to enforce their red lines. That, I have no doubt, is what Gerasimov's call was actually about. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, it is a fact that since that call, and since the Oreshnik strike and the destruction by the Russians of the 5 ATACMS launchers, and the destruction by the Russians, or rather the hunting by the Russians of personnel, US and Western personnel in Ukraine, we have had no more missile strikes on Russian territory. Doesn't mean that there never will be any more missile strikes. In Washington, often they find it very difficult to get the message. But that, I am sure, was the message that General Gerasimov was imparting. And Lavrov gave the same message publicly to Tucker Carlson over the course of his interview. He said that the Russians were looking with utmost gravity upon the missile strikes on their territory. Lavrov called it mainland Russia, so to speak. Just to say, let's say pre-2014 Russia. The Russians took that very, very seriously, that it was a crossing of the red line, that the Oreshnik, that its strike on the Yuzhmash factory was absolutely intended as a warning. And Lavrov said that he hoped that the warning would be heeded. And Lavrov went on to say that, if the warning was not heeded, the Russians did absolutely have the resolve to escalate in response, and that strikes on facilities, military facilities in Europe, which the Russians unquestionably do have the capability to conduct, would indeed take place, and that might lead to uncontrolled escalation. And the Russians most definitely were not seeking a nuclear war with the United States. They were certainly not in the business of wanting exchanges of tactical nuclear missiles, anything of that kind, nuclear weapons or anything of that kind. But if such a thing were to happen, and the possibility cannot be excluded, then the Americans must not assume that the Russians at any point are going to back down. So it was a pretty clear warning from Lavrov made to Tucker Carlson. And it was a pretty clear warning, I'm sure, made by Gerasimov to Brown over the course of that call. There may, in fact, have been other communications by the Russians as well. We will just have to wait and see. So, overall, a very uncompromising position taken by Lavrov, but not one that slams the door. The Russians still want better relations with the Americans. This is not because they have any romantic illusions about the Americans anymore. It is because it is in their interests to at least de-escalate tensions in Europe so that they have security on their western borders, so they can focus on their own internal development. A point that Putin made, by the way, in a speech that he gave to the Collegium of the Russian Foreign Ministry in autumn 2021. A speech which repays reading and which many people have lost interest in wrongly in my opinion. But the Russians are not going to compromise on any fundamental issues that affect their vital interests and security. NATO membership for Ukraine, troops, Western troops in Ukraine, Western bases in Ukraine, any of those things. And on the 4 regions, publicly, the Russians continue to be unyielding. So, to repeat again, there is scope for negotiations between the Russians and the Americans. But they must take place based on an understanding that the Russians are going to win the war. In fact, in practical terms, they have already done so. I am not sure that this is fully understood yet in the United States. Now, I saw a snippet of news today. It appeared somewhere in the media, I'm not sure where, and I don't think it is especially reliable. But if it is true, it highlights the problem that the West faces. A couple of years ago, to the fury of France, the Australian government went back on a deal it had reached with France to buy diesel submarines from the French to replace Australia's own very run-down submarine force. And the Australians instead looked to the United States and Britain to provide them with nuclear submarines. And according to this report, which, as I said, I'm not sure that it's terribly reliable, by the way, but it said that the construction by the United States of these nuclear submarines is looking like it's moving further and further away on the time horizon, creating for Australia a growing gap in capability, to the point where there are now apparently some voices in Australia that say that Australia made a huge mistake in going with this deal, part of the AUKUS arrangement, and that they should look again at the original agreement they had with France. Well, all of that may be true, but there is no doubt at all that the situation with both the American and the British submarine fleets is not particularly good. I've heard reports that most British submarines, I even saw one report which said that all British submarines, nuclear submarines, are now pretty much most of the time, nearly all of the time now, perhaps even all the time in port, because there is a massive backlog in essential work and repairs that they need, and that they're not really in a fit condition to go to sea. Again, that might be an overstatement of the reality, and if so, I acknowledge the fact in advance. But it does seem as if there are serious problems with the British nuclear submarine fleet. And the same, it seems, though to a significantly lesser extent, of course, is also true with the US Navy's submarine fleet. Apparently, there are problems of availability of submarines, of repair and maintenance of submarines, and I gather that construction of nuclear submarines is now well behind schedule altogether. For the record, since Russian nuclear submarine construction started about 15 years ago, as I remember, Russian building of nuclear submarines, the Borets and the Yasins, has been on a steadily rising curve and continues. And it does seem as if the Russian submarine fleet, nuclear submarine fleet, is much more active and presumably in better shape, certainly than the British submarine fleet is, and perhaps even than the American submarine fleet is. Anyway, my point is I'm not here to make comparisons between the Americans and the Russians on submarines and the size of their submarine fleet and those kind of things. My point is that if this report is true, then we see again that there are problems in the United States in terms of construction of weapon systems. Things which 50 years ago the United States could do. It could produce nuclear submarines in significant numbers without strain. It is now finding much more difficult. And that plays back into the situation in Ukraine. There isn't that surge capability with weapons. There's no ability to flood Ukraine with weapons to such a degree that it will radically change the character of the war there. On the contrary, it is the Russians who continue to increase the volume of their weapons production. And as I discussed yesterday in my program, based on what Putin said at this investment forum, the Russians still actually have leeway to produce more and are looking to produce more over the course of next year. So the gap in capabilities, certainly in terms of the war in Ukraine, is set to grow. So this has to be the starting point of any negotiation. The Russians are winning the war on the ground. They're winning the economic and industrial war. In any negotiation, that means that they're not going to make any significant concessions. They're going to push hard in order to put themselves in the strongest position with respect to the West that they can, taking into account the long, difficult history, the history, as the Russians would say, as I personally would also say, of broken promises and agreements, of Western meddling in their affairs, of lectures and bullying and all of that kind of thing that we have seen ever since the end of the Cold War. So a negotiation can take place, certainly. It can bring about the end of the war, definitely. I say definitely. It can move towards de-escalating the crisis over the war between the two superpowers, Russia and America. But the Russians are in the driving seat, and as Lavrov's interview with Tucker Carlson has shown, they know it. Now, before I leave my discussion of Lavrov's interview, I just wanted to say that Lavrov did talk about other things, and one of the things that stood out for me was that he mentioned Russia's relationship with Finland. And here he made, I thought, some rather plaintive comments. He said that the Russians had assumed after the Second World War, when they fought Finland, that the relationship with Finland had become a friendly one. Finland had become a neutral country during the Cold War. It had a close economic and relationship with Russia. The Soviet leaders and the leaders of Finland had appeared to be on good terms with each other. And Lavrov, I thought, expressed the Russian surprise and bitterness at the way everything in Finland completely turned round. How Finland suddenly and abruptly reversed its long-standing cordial relationship with Russia, how the border was closed, anti-Russian rhetoric suddenly exploded in Finland itself, how Finland joined NATO, how it reversed in a matter of just a few days the decades of seemingly strong and friendly relations between Finland and Russia, which had always existed. And in what I thought was a particularly bitter sentence, Lavrov said that perhaps all of that friendship with Finland was never real. Perhaps deep down, the Finns always resented and were uncomfortable with their friendship with Russia. Perhaps this reversal of attitudes shows that the Finns now finally feel that they can act towards the Russians as they have always felt. Now, having been to Finland and having known quite a few Finns in my time, I think that this is not actually true. I think many people in Finland, on the contrary, had come to understand the importance of the relationship with Russia. I got the impression that many people in Finland, in fact, had come to feel very comfortable with the relationship with Russia. One should not mistake the actions and sentiments of the political class in Finland with that of the wider Finnish people. But I suspect that here Lavrov is voicing a wider sentiment that exists in Russia. That the Russians over the last 3 years, and perhaps to some extent even before, in the decades since the end of the Cold War, have come to see what Westerners, including obviously the Finns, actually feel about them. They've been taken aback by the degree of hostility, and that they have lost their belief or former expectation that there can ever be a genuinely good relationship between the Russians and the nations and the other European nations. And that is something which, again, Westerners, Western governments, Western commentators need to take into account. I doubt, frankly, that at the end of this war, even if we do see a general de-escalation of tensions, we're actually going to see any real shift in any real warming of relations between Russia and the European states. What we're going to see instead, or so it seems to me, is a very cold peace. That is obviously better than the kind of war situation which we have now, but it is still going to fall far short of the hopes that many people had at the end of the Cold War. As for expectations or hopes that some people have of a general restoration of economic contacts, of Russian gas and raw materials flowing again to the West, of Western companies being able to re-enter the Russian market, I think these are going to be disappointed. Some Russian gas, no doubt, will flow back to Europe, but nothing like on the level that we saw before 2022. And as Putin pointed out, at that investment forum, which I discussed yesterday, when answering questions from a German businessman, German companies will find it very difficult to return to the Russian market and to occupy the position in the Russian market that they had prior to 2022, because their places have now been taken by Russian companies and companies from other places, obviously many of them from China. So the illusion, because that's what it turned out to be, of a completed Europe with Russia becoming a part of it, I think it's gone, probably forever. Just saying. Anyway, let me now conclude by doing a quick summary of the military situation on the Ukrainian battlefields, because we are seeing, as I said, a very rapid acceleration of what is happening, of the Russian advances. And that can be gauged by just looking at the Russian Defense Ministry bulletin that came out shortly before I started this program. Now, this bulletin refers to no fewer than 6 villages captured by the Russian military over the course of a single 24-hour period. Now, I think that we need to take this a little bit with a pinch of salt, because some of these villages have probably been captured previously. In fact, in some cases, I know they have. But nonetheless, it does give us a sense of how rapidly things are moving. So they say, first of all, that the Russian military have advanced, and as a result of active operations, the South Group of Forces liberated Ilinka and Romanovka. These are 2 villages south of Kurakhove. We will come to those shortly. They then go on to say that as a result of active operations, units of the East Group of Forces liberated Novodarovka, this is in Zaporozhye region, and also Suhiyali, which is also a village south of Kurakhove. And then they went on to say that another group of forces managed to liberate 2 other places further north, apparently in the Pokrovsk area. So we could see that the general pattern is of the Russian advances continuing to accelerate. They are moving faster. The Russians are taking more territory. The center group of forces continued advancing in the depth of the enemy's defenses and liberated Petrovka and Pustinka. As I said, these are 2 places north of Selidovo and south of Pokrovsk. So a whole cluster of villages: Ilinka, Romanovka, Petrovka, Pustinka, Suhiyali, and this other place, Novodarovka, which I don't know about. They've all been liberated, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, within the last 24 hours, all of which speaks of a very rapid rate of advance. Now, the most dramatic events are taking place in and around Kurakhove. So the place that the Russian Defense Ministry mentions, Suhiyali, one of them, is to the southwest of Kurakhove, and the other 2 places that the Russian Ministry of Defense mentioned, Romanovka and Ilinka, are to the southeast of Kurakhove. Between these places, there are a cluster of other villages, of which the most important is a place called Uspenivka, which is apparently some sort of a fortified position. Apparently there are reports that the Russians have broken into Uspenivka, and they've also advanced into Constantinople, which is the village immediately to the east, to the west rather, of Uspenivka. In fact, there are some reports this morning which claim that Constantinople has actually been fully captured. So, what has actually happened, what all of these reports tell us, is that there's a group of Ukrainian troops located in Uspenivka, Garnivka, and Vesely Gai, 3 villages, and they're now surrounded in effect by the Russians. The Russians have taken Suhiyali, which is to the west of these villages, and Romanovka and Ilinka, that are to the east of these villages. The Russians also control Danye, which is located to the north of these villages, and I understand that they also control Trudova and other villages which are located to the south of these villages. So we are looking in effect at an actual cauldron, and there are reports that perhaps as many as 1,000 Ukrainian troops are located in this area. And the Russians also, it's now universally acknowledged by all the mapping projects, are in control of the village of Stary Terny at the northwestern end of the Kurakhove reservoir, and that they're advancing through boggy and swampy terrain caused by the destruction of the Kurakhove dam towards the village of Dachny. And it looks as if the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhove as well, now basically pushed to the western part of this town, are also soon going to be in a cauldron. And further north, in Pakrovsk, where 2 of these other villages are located, it looks as if another cauldron is gradually developing around the small village of Shevchenko, that this area also looks like it could fall into a cauldron fairly soon. We'll just have to wait and see. But certainly the situation around Pakrovsk is getting particularly difficult for the Ukrainians as well, as the Russians gradually clear up all of the villages immediately to the south of Pakrovsk. Now, we haven't had any further news this morning about the situation in Velika Novosilka, which is a little bit to the southeast of these places. There's still some claims that there's fighting going on for control of the village of Novi Komar, though everybody accepts that this village will be captured by the Russians very soon if they don't control it already, which would also, in effect, result in the virtual encirclement of Velikaya Novosilka. But there are also rumours that the Russians are not only preparing a major offensive in Zaporozhye region, possibly after Velikaya Novosilka falls, but that they're also planning some kind of return to Kherson region west of the Dnieper, that they've assembled significant forces on the east bank of the Dnieper, opposite Kherson city, and that they might be planning some kind of a return there. And both in Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, the Russians seem to have made significant further advances. It looks as if they're in fact rapidly clearing the factory area in Chasiv Yar. And the latest reports suggest that that small area of high-rise buildings in north-central part of Toretsk, which was the last remaining significant position that the Ukrainians hold in Toretsk, that the Russians captured it. Again, it looks like they stormed it and captured it, perhaps over the course of a single day. So, some are saying that within 2 or 3 weeks, the battles for Toretsk and Chasiv Yar will have ended, that these 2 towns will have been brought fully under Russian control before the end of the year. And, well, we can see that Kurakhove definitely is now about to fall, that Ukrainian troops have been caught in a cauldron in all sorts of places. And in the meantime, the Russians continue advances in other places. They're said to be reinforcing in Kupiansk, and they continue their missile and drone offensive across Ukraine. And of course, they also have the Oreshnik in reserve in case it's needed. So it's a grim picture in Ukraine and a darkening one for the Ukrainians. Whether the Ukrainians are able to make the kind of concessions that the Russians would expect in negotiations remains to be seen. Whether the United States fully understands how weak its cards are in Ukraine also remains to be seen. But the trajectory of travel in Ukraine is clear, and I would say definitely irreversible. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Tomorrow, I will discuss the fall of the French government, which is an interesting event, by the way, and one which Alex and I have done a program about for the Duran. I will also, by the way, touch on recent events in Romania, where the victory of Mr. Ioescu, a man who has called into question the wisdom of Romania's involvement in the Ukraine war, horrified the Romanian establishment, the European Union, NATO, and the United States, and where, unsurprisingly, predictably, the results of the first round of the elections, which he won, have now been annulled. I'm going to make a prediction that he's going to be prevented from standing if this first round of the elections is held again. So it seems that one is fine to win elections. One is perfectly free to vote for whomever one wishes, provided the correct candidate wins. This is the story now increasingly in parts of Europe, maybe not yet in all of Europe. Thankfully, as we saw recently, it is not yet the story in the United States. But anyway, there we are. I will talk about these topics, I hope, in the program tomorrow. There are obviously events in Ukraine and also in Syria may get in the way. But anyway, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can find, you can also check out, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't also forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.